An entire interconnected world vanished in a human lifetime. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, the great civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Near East fell into ruin, plunging regions into a silence that would last for centuries. Historian Eric H. Klein calls it a perfect storm of calamities. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the complex web of reasons why societies crumble, a lesson written in ancient dust that speaks directly to our modern world. We will walk the bustling ports and grand palaces that were suddenly abandoned. We will confront mysterious invaders from the sea and a climate that turned against humanity. How could such advanced and powerful networks fail so completely? What does their story whisper to us about the fragility of our own global system? When you think about the forces that hold a civilization together, which one feels the most fragile today? This was a globalized world long before the word was ever coined. Think of it not as a collection of separate kingdoms, but as a single, sprawling network, a delicate and brilliant ecosystem of civilization. At its heart were the great palaces like the one at Pylos in Greece or Hattusa in the land of the Hittites. These were not just royal homes, they were the central servers of their age. Within their archives, thousands of clay tablets recorded everything from grain shipments and bronze allotments to treaties and diplomatic correspondence. The entire economy and social order depended on this meticulous, palace-centered system, and the lifeblood of that system was bronze. This alloy of copper and tin was more than a metal. It was the essential ingredient for weapons, tools, and prestige objects. But here was the catch: the two metals rarely came from the same place. Copper might be mined on Cyprus, while the nearest tin deposits were thousands of kilometers away in places like Afghanistan or Cornwall. This necessity created the web. Merchant ships laden with copper ingots sailed from Cyprus to the ports of the Levant. Caravans carried tin across mountains and deserts. This trade in raw materials also carried luxury goods: ivory from Africa, lapis lazuli from the East, fine textiles and pottery. And with the goods came people, ideas, and words. We see this intimate connection in the Amarna letters, a diplomatic archive found in Egypt. Here, the pharaoh corresponded as an equal with other great kings, using a shared diplomatic language, addressing them as "my brother." They negotiated marriages, exchanged lavish gifts, and complained about wayward merchants. It was a club of superpowers maintaining a fragile balance. The wealth this system generated was staggering, supporting not just kings and soldiers, but also scribes, engineers, jewelers, and fresco painters who covered palace walls with vibrant scenes of life and myth. This was the peak, a golden age of interconnected prosperity that had taken centuries to build, which makes what happened next not merely a collapse, but a system's failure of breathtaking speed and completeness. The entire network short-circuited. To understand that catastrophic failure, we must first look at the pressures that began to strain this glittering web to its breaking point. The first crack in the system appeared on the horizon in the form of ships. In the mortuary temple of Rameses III at Medinet Habu in Egypt, a massive stone relief tells a story of chaos. It shows a desperate naval battle, Egyptian forces fighting against a bewildering array of warriors. These enemies wear feathered headdresses and carry round shields and long swords. The Egyptian inscriptions give them a collective, ominous name: the Sea Peoples. For over a century, this image has dominated our understanding of the collapse, a theory of violent external conquest. The story goes that a confederation of seafaring raiders, driven by hunger or ambition, swept out of the central Mediterranean. They moved along the coastlines like a storm surge, attacking and burning the wealthy ports that were the nodes of the Bronze Age network. The great trading city of Ugarit on the coast of modern Syria provides haunting evidence. Archaeologists found a clay tablet in a kiln, a letter that was never sent. In it, the king of Ugarit writes a frantic reply to a plea for help, stating, "My father, the enemy's ships are already here. They have set fire to my towns and have done very great damage in the country." The letter ends there. The city was burned to the ground and never reoccupied. From Greece to the Levant, similar layers of ash and destruction mark this period. It is a compelling narrative of fire and sword, of mighty kingdoms brought low by mysterious invaders from the sea. Yet, the identity of these sea peoples is one of history's great puzzles. The Egyptian reliefs list names like the Peliset, the Shekelesh, and the Denyen, but who were they? Were they a unified army with a homeland, or a desperate mix of displaced people, mercenaries, and pirates thrown together by the chaos of the age? Some scholars now see them not as the initial cause, but as a symptom. Think of a forest weakened by drought and disease. When a lightning strike finally ignites it, the fire spreads with terrifying speed. The lightning gets the blame, but the true vulnerability was the condition of the forest itself. Were the sea peoples the lightning bolt, or were they simply the wildfire, feeding on a civilization already critically weakened? This question shifts our gaze from the battles on the shore to the quieter, more profound crises unfolding inland. But a changing climate is an enemy no army can defeat. While the reliefs at Medinet Habu show battles on the water, a quieter, more profound story was being written in the mud at the bottom of ancient lakes. Paleoclimatologists, scientists who study past climates, have drilled deep into sediments from Turkey to Israel. Within those layers of silt and pollen, they have found a stark record of catastrophe. The data tells us of a prolonged and severe megadrought that gripped the eastern Mediterranean for nearly 300 years, reaching its most intense phase right at the moment the palaces fell silent. This was not a single bad season, it was a relentless, generations-long drying of the world. You can almost feel the desperation build. Picture the annual harvest, the foundation of every Bronze Age kingdom, failing not once or twice but for decades. The rivers that fed the great agricultural plains shrank to trickles. Springs that had never failed went dry. Famine would have become a constant, unwelcome guest in every home, from the peasant's hut to the royal court. Archaeologist Brandon Drake and others point out that these societies were exquisitely tuned to a specific climate pattern. Their entire surplus, their wealth, their very stability depended on predictable rains. When that predictability vanished, the system had no backup plan. The consequences rippled outward with terrifying logic. No surplus grain meant no extra food to pay the vast armies of scribes, artisans, and soldiers who made the palace system work. It meant no food to send as aid to allied kingdoms when they, too, pleaded for help. It meant populations had to move, abandoning ancestral homes in search of water and food. This is where the story of the sea peoples transforms. When viewed through the lens of this megadrought, those mysterious invaders begin to look less like a coordinated naval armada and more like a tide of desperate humanity. They were likely a mix of displaced farmers, coastal communities whose fisheries failed, and opportunistic warriors, all set in motion by the same ecological disaster. They were not the lightning strike that started the fire, they were the wind spreading the flames from one tinder-dry kingdom to the next. This forces a humbling realization. The most sophisticated diplomacy, the mightiest armies, the most intricate trade networks, they all depend on a stable foundation of water and food. When that foundation crumbles, the social contract can dissolve with shocking speed. It makes you wonder, in our own interconnected world, what seemingly small environmental thread, if pulled, could begin to unravel the entire tapestry. Yet another force was shaking the very foundations of this world, quite literally. beneath the drought and the social unrest, the ground itself began to revolt. The eastern Mediterranean sits atop a treacherous web of fault lines, and evidence suggests that in the final century of the Bronze Age, this entire region entered what geophysicists call an earthquake storm. This is not a single catastrophic event, but a domino effect of major seismic shocks rippling across the landscape over decades, each one weakening the structures and the spirit of the people. Archaeologist Amos Nerd championed this idea, observing that the destruction layers in city after city, from Mycenaean in Greece to Hattusa in Anatolia, tell a specific story. First came the violent shaking that toppled massive stone walls and collapsed grand staircases. Then, in the rubble, fires broke out from overturned lamps and shattered grain stores, completing the devastation. Imagine the profound psychological impact. If a prolonged drought taught people that the sky could be an enemy, the earthquake storm taught them that the very earth beneath their feet was not safe. The centralized palace, that towering symbol of order and divine favor, could be reduced to ruin in moments. This was more than just physical damage. It was a blow to the core ideology of these kingdoms. Their authority was built on the promise of stability and protection. When the gods, or simply nature's mechanics, seemed to turn against that promise, faith in the entire system would have eroded as quickly as the palace walls. The practical consequences were equally dire. The palaces were not just administrative centers, they were the granaries and treasuries of the state. An earthquake that collapsed these storerooms meant the loss of the entire food surplus, the wealth reserve that could see a kingdom through a single lean year. With that buffer gone in an instant, a society already stressed by drought had no cushion left. Trade routes, dependent on intact ports and secure mountain passes, would have been severed by landslides and shattered infrastructure. The earthquake storm theory does not stand alone as a single cause, but it provides a crucial piece of the puzzle. It represents the physical dismantling of the urban and economic framework. A society can perhaps rebuild after one quake, but when the tremors keep coming for a generation, when every attempt at recovery is met with another collapse, the will to rebuild fades. The message from the earth was relentless, and eventually people stopped listening, choosing instead to leave the crumbled palaces behind. This layering of disasters creates a chilling picture, a convergence where environmental, human, and geological crises began to amplify one another. But to understand the final collapse, we must look at how these external pressures ignited a fire within the very heart of the system, turning citizens not just against invaders or nature, but against their own rulers. The greatest threat to a palace may not have come from outside its walls, but from within its own courtyards. After generations of drought, quakes, and raids, the final breaking point was social. These glittering Bronze Age kingdoms were built on a foundation of profound inequality. At the top sat a tiny, literate elite of kings, priests, and administrators, living in splendor funded by the labor of the vast majority. Below them stretched a pyramid of specialized workers, soldiers, and merchants, all supported by the peasant farmers who worked the land. This was a system of meticulous extraction. Taxes in the form of grain, oil, and wine flowed upward to the palace storerooms. In return, the palace provided security, organized large projects, and redistributed some goods. It was a contract, and for centuries it held. But what happens when the palace can no longer uphold its end of the bargain? When the storerooms are empty from famine, when the walls lie broken from earthquakes, and when the king's armies cannot stop the raiders? The contract shatters. Historian Robert Drews frames this as a systems collapse. The entire intricate machine of the Bronze Age state, with its scribes recording every jar of oil and its officials coordinating international trade, was incredibly specialized and interdependent. Remove a few key components, and the entire mechanism grinds to a halt. Imagine the palace scribe, the human database of the kingdom. If he perishes in a conflict or simply flees the crumbling city, who then knows how to allocate the remaining grain, or which merchant is owed a shipment of copper. That knowledge disappears in a generation. The specialized potter who made beautiful painted vessels for the elite no longer has a market. The soldier who guarded the trade routes finds no caravans to protect. The entire reason for their highly skilled existence evaporates. This perspective suggests the end was less a single dramatic conquest and more a slow, grinding dissolution. Faced with a central authority that could no longer feed, protect, or employ them, people made a rational choice. They voted with their feet. They abandoned the starving, vulnerable cities and returned to the hills to a simpler, more sustainable life of subsistence farming and pastoral herding. The archaeological record shows this clearly. The grand urban centers were often not resettled for centuries, but in the surrounding highlands, life continued. The technology did not vanish, it simplified. The beautiful linear B script of the Mycenaeans was forgotten because in a village of a few families, you do not need a complex administrative language. You just need to know your family and your land. This internal revolt was not necessarily a violent uprising, though that certainly occurred in places. It was a quieter, more profound rejection. It was the collective decision of a population to walk away from a system that had become a burden rather than a benefit. The elite, whose power was entirely dependent on that system, were left isolated in their decaying palaces, their authority meaning nothing without people to acknowledge it. This forces a difficult question about civilization itself. How much loyalty does a social order truly command when the comforts it provides disappear? The story of the Bronze Age collapse warns us that the most dangerous cracks are not always in the walls we build against outsiders, but in the foundations of the society we build for ourselves. And in the silence that followed this great unraveling, a new and mysterious chapter began, one defined not by grand palaces, but by scattered villages and a profound forgetting. The intricate web of trade was the civilization's nervous system, and when it was severed, the entire body went numb. Bronze was not just a metal, it was the essential technology of the age, the very definition of progress. But its creation was a geographic miracle, demanding two metals that never naturally occurred together. Copper flowed from mines on Cyprus and in the Sinai, while tin, the rarer and more critical ingredient, traveled from sources thousands of kilometers away, possibly as far as Afghanistan or even Cornwall in Britain. This necessity forged an international supply chain of breathtaking complexity and fragility. Merchant ships laden with copper ingots, ox hide shaped for easy carrying, sailed between a handful of major ports. Overland caravans guarded at great cost brought tin through mountain passes and across deserts. The entire military and economic might of kingdoms from Greece to Mesopotamia depended on this steady, reliable flow. It was a system that worked brilliantly in a world at peace, under stable governments that honored treaties and protected trade routes, but it had no redundancy, no backup plan. Scholar Susan Scherer highlights this as a core vulnerability, a case of fatal interdependence. The entire globalized structure was only as strong as its weakest link. If pirates, perhaps those very sea peoples, began to raid the shipping lanes, the cost and risk of transport would skyrocket. If a key partner kingdom, like the Hittite Empire controlling vital land routes, suddenly collapsed into chaos, the caravan trails would fall silent. If a distant tin mining region was lost to conflict or migration, the supply would simply stop. One break in the chain could cascade into systemic failure. Picture the ripple effects. A palace armory, expecting a shipment of tin to forge new swords for its army, receives nothing. The bronze smiths, highly specialized artisans, have no work. The military, facing raids with dwindling supplies of functional weapons, becomes less effective, inviting more attacks. The king, unable to equip soldiers or produce the bronze goods that symbolize status and gift-giving in diplomacy, loses authority both at home and abroad. This was more than an economic recession, it was a technological regression. Societies that had mastered the complex alchemy of bronze suddenly found their defining knowledge useless. The scarcity would have bred hoarding, inequality, and desperation, turning former trading partners into rivals fighting over the last remaining stocks. In this vacuum of bronze, a different metal began its slow ascent, iron. While the full Iron Age was still centuries away, the collapse created the conditions for its rise. Iron ore is far more common than tin, found in local deposits almost everywhere. The technology to smelt it effectively was initially more difficult, but the incentive to develop it was now overwhelming. You did not need a vast international network to procure iron, you needed a local bloomery and a skilled smith. The shift from bronze to iron, then, was not merely a technological upgrade, it was a profound social and political reorganization. It moved the basis of power from controlling distant, fragile trade routes to mastering local resources and knowledge. The collapse of the bronze trade network did not just weaken kingdoms, it made their entire way of life obsolete. It asks us a pointed question about our own world, where a disruption in the flow of semiconductors or energy can ripple across the globe in days. How many of our most critical systems are built on a faith in stability that the Bronze Age learned too late can vanish in a season? The final, chilling truth lies not in a single disaster but in their terrifying convergence. Historian Eric H. Klein, who has spent decades studying this era, offers the clearest modern explanation. He states it was the combination of all of these factors, environmental, economic, and political, that led to the collapse. Think of it not as a sequence of separate tragedies, but as a perfect storm where each element amplified the others into an unstoppable force. A prolonged drought weakens a kingdom's agricultural base, leading to famine and social unrest. This internal strain makes it harder to muster an effective defense against opportunistic raiders from the sea. Those raids further disrupt the already fragile trade networks, cutting off the supply of bronze needed for weapons and tools. Meanwhile, a series of major earthquakes shatters the physical infrastructure, toppling palace granaries and severing communication routes. The ruling elite, now unable to feed, protect, or employ their people, faces a crisis of legitimacy. The social contract dissolves and populations abandon the cities. This creates a vacuum of power and order, which invites more migration and conflict, feeding back into the cycle. It is a devastating feedback loop where no single problem was insurmountable on its own, but together they became catastrophic. Imagine a pyramid built from wooden blocks. You can remove one block from the base, and the structure might wobble but remain standing. Now, imagine striking 3 or 4 critical blocks simultaneously from different angles. The entire pyramid disintegrates in an instant. That is the systemic view of the Bronze Age collapse. It moves us away from the hunt for a simple villain, a singular smoking gun like the Sea Peoples, and toward a more profound and perhaps more unsettling understanding. Civilizations are not machines with a single point of failure. They are complex ecosystems. They are webs of dependency between people, the environment, technology, and belief. For centuries, the late Bronze Age ecosystem was in a delicate, prosperous balance. But when multiple systemic stressors converged, climate, seismology, economics, and sociology, the entire network's resilience evaporated. The system did not have a backup mode. There was no plan B for a world where the rain stopped, the earth shook, the ships stopped sailing, and the people stopped believing. This nonlinear process is the sobering lesson written in the ashes of Hattusa and the silent ruins of Pylos. It shows us that collapse is rarely a simple story of invasion or natural disaster. It is the story of a world pushed past a tipping point, where interconnected vulnerabilities suddenly become interconnected failures. and it begs us to look at our own glittering, globalized ecosystem and ask not what single event could bring it down, but what combination of stresses might push it toward a similar, unimaginable edge. The story of this collapse is not just written in theories, but in the ash and clay of a single, vibrant city. On the coast of what is now Syria, the great port of Ugarit stood as a testament to the interconnected world. Its ruins reveal a cosmopolitan hub where merchants from Egypt, Anatolia, and the Aegean walked streets lined with grand houses and workshops. The city's true voice, however, comes from its palace archives, rooms filled with thousands of clay tablets. These were not just local records, but a library of international diplomacy and trade, written in a dozen different languages including Akkadian, the lingua franca of the era. Ugarit was a critical node, a bustling switchboard in the Bronze Age network, thriving on the exchange of copper, tin, ivory, and wine. Its wealth and security were built entirely on that web of mutual agreements and timely shipments. And then, one day, the web caught fire. The archaeological layer marking the city's end is a stark, thick band of ash and collapsed masonry. The destruction was sudden, comprehensive, and intentional. Grand buildings were torched, their walls scorched and toppled in a single, violent event. But among the ruins, archaeologists found something even more telling than the evidence of flame. In a pottery kiln, a clay tablet lay waiting, hardened by a fire that was never meant to bake it. It is a letter, a desperate final message from the last king of Ugarit to the ruler of Alatia, ancient Cyprus. His words are a snapshot of pure systemic failure. He writes that all of his troops are stationed far away with the Hittite fleet. His own ships are on patrol along the Lycian coast, and the enemy's ships have already arrived. He states plainly, "They have set fire to my towns and have done very great damage in the country." The plea ends there, unfinished and unsent. The enemy was already inside the gates. This single artifact captures the entire catastrophe in microcosm. Here was a king following the rules of the international system, lending his forces to a powerful ally as the treaties demanded. Yet that very act left his own city defenseless. The aid network, that promise of mutual security between brother kings, had failed utterly. No help came from Cyprus or from the Hittites, who were likely fighting for their own survival. Ugarit's fate demonstrates that external threat and internal vulnerability are two sides of the same coin. Its wealth made it a target, its commitments left it exposed, and the entire diplomatic safety net it depended on vanished when tested. The city did not slowly decline. It was extinguished in a moment of terrifying clarity, a blazing signal fire marking the end of an era. Its silent ruins ask us a haunting question: how many of our own modern safety nets are just untested promises, waiting for a moment when everyone needs help at the same time? The citadels of Mycenaean and Pylos stand today as silent stone sentinels, their massive cyclopean walls hinting at a power that once commanded the Aegean. These were the seats of the Mycenaean Greeks, a civilization of warrior kings whose legends would later echo through the epics of Homer. Their palaces were bustling centers of administration, stocked with treasures from across the known world, and governed through the intricate linear B script. Yet around the year 1200 before the Common Era, the lights went out in these great halls, not with a dramatic siege, but with a profound and eerie quiet. The story here is not one of obvious conquest. Archaeologists find little evidence of a foreign army storming the gates. Instead, the tale is told in subtler signs. At some sites, there are signs of fire, but often limited to the palace complex itself, suggesting internal rebellion or conflict rather than an external assault. The grand Megaron halls where kings held court were abandoned. The workshops of specialist artisans fell silent. Most tellingly, the population didn't just decline, it vanished from the archaeological record. It's as if the people simply melted away from the urban centers. This points to a different kind of societal failure, one driven from within. The highly centralized palace economy, with its strict hierarchies and complex redistribution of goods, appears to have simply stopped functioning. When the system could no longer deliver security or sustenance, the social contract that bound people to the palace and its demanding taxes dissolved. Communities made a pragmatic choice, abandoning the vulnerable, resource-intensive citadels for a more sustainable life in scattered, self-sufficient villages in the highlands. The cultural regression that followed was staggering. The linear B script, used solely for palace accounting and administration, was completely forgotten. With no central authority to keep records for, there was no need for scribes. The knowledge of writing, a technology that had defined their bureaucratic power, disappeared from Greece for over 4 centuries. The practice of building tholos tombs, those magnificent beehive-shaped monuments for the elite, ceased entirely. The intricate art of fresco painting and fine seal stone carving was lost. Even the style of pottery became simpler, more functional. This was not a temporary setback, it was a wholesale simplification of society, a voluntary step back from complexity. Scholars call the centuries that followed the Greek Dark Age, not because people were ignorant, but because from our perspective, the historical record goes dark. Without written documents, without grand monuments, we lose the detailed voice of the culture. Life continued, but it was local, small-scale, and focused on survival. The glittering network that connected Mycenae to Egypt and Anatolia was severed, leaving isolated communities to reinvent their world from the ground up. This case study forces us to expand our definition of collapse. It doesn't always look like a city burning under a foreign torch. Sometimes, collapse looks like a palace gate left open, a scribe putting down his stylus for the last time, and a population walking away into the hills, choosing a quieter, poorer, but perhaps more resilient existence over the crumbling glory of a failed state. What does it say about a civilization when its people willingly forget the very written language that once managed their world? The Hittite Empire was a colossus of the ancient world. From their fortified capital high on the Anatolian plateau at Hattusa, they commanded a realm that stretched from the Aegean coast to the borders of Mesopotamia, a true superpower that stood toe-to-toe with pharaonic Egypt. Theirs was an empire built on shrewd diplomacy, military might, and a complex system of control. Rather than directly occupying every territory, they ruled through a network of vassal states, local kings bound by treaty and oath to the great king in Hattusa. The loyalty of these vassals was secured by a simple, powerful promise. The central power would provide military protection and, crucially, economic support in times of need. This system was a masterpiece of imperial management, but it had one profound weakness: it was utterly dependent on consistency. The heart of that promise was grain. The arid Anatolian plateau was not a land of endless bounty, and the populations of the capital and its core territories relied on regular shipments of food from more fertile, often distant provinces. When those shipments stopped, the entire imperial logic began to unravel, and in the late 13th century before the Common Era, the shipments did stop. A devastating drought, confirmed by tree ring and sediment studies, gripped the region for generations. The breadbasket provinces could no longer produce a surplus, and what little they had, they likely kept for themselves. At the same moment, external pressures mounted. From the north came the constant raids of the Kaskian tribes, a perennial thorn in the Hittite side that now became a mortal threat as frontier defenses were weakened by resource shortages. And from the western coasts came the ominous movement of the Sea Peoples, disrupting the vital maritime trade links and attacking coastal vassal states, severing the empire's connections to the wider world. The Hittite response was fractured and slow, a sign of a central authority losing its grip. Evidence suggests different regional governors, or even members of the royal family, may have begun acting independently, hoarding resources and making separate peace deals in a desperate bid for local survival. The delicate balance of loyalty and obligation that held the empire together simply snapped. Then came the final, definitive act. The great capital of Hattusa, a city of monumental gates, vast temples, and underground granaries, was not conquered in a legendary siege. Instead, it was systematically abandoned. The royal archives, a library of thousands of clay tablets detailing laws, treaties, and rituals, were left in orderly rows. The city's inhabitants took what they could carry and left, setting key buildings ablaze on their way out. It was a controlled, deliberate evacuation, a recognition that the imperial project was over. The site would lie empty for millennia, never reoccupied as a major center. The completeness of their disappearance is perhaps the most startling part of their story. Within a few generations, the Hittites vanished not just from power but from human memory. Their language, their history, their very name were erased from the record. To later civilizations like the Greeks, the massive stone ruins in Anatolia were the work of mythical giants or forgotten heroes. It was only in the early 20th century, through the patient work of archaeologists and linguists deciphering those abandoned clay tablets, that this lost empire was pulled back into the light of history. Their story is a humbling lesson in fragility. It demonstrates that even the most formidable political and military structures are ecosystems, dependent on a flow of loyalty, goods, and information. When drought strangles the supply lines and chaos severs the connections, the center cannot hold. The silence that fell over Hattusa is a powerful reminder that human achievements, no matter how grand, are not permanent inscriptions, but stories written in sand, waiting for the wind to change. Yet amid this symphony of ruin, one great power managed to hold the line. New Kingdom Egypt stood as the lone survivor, a battered but unbroken fortress in a collapsing world. While the Hittite Empire vanished and the Mycenaean palaces emptied, the land of the pharaohs endured, but its survival came at a price that would define its future. The evidence of this desperate struggle is carved into the very stone of Egypt's monuments. At the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, the story is told in relentless detail. The reliefs show a chaotic naval battle, Egyptian warships with archers in their rigging confronting a ragged armada of enemy vessels. The inscriptions name these foes, the Sea Peoples, listing tribes like the Peleset and the Shekelesh. Pharaoh Ramesses III claims a great victory, stating he smashed them like vessels of pottery. His predecessor, Merneptah, had earlier recorded a similar triumph on a stone stele, boasting of repelling a massive coalition of invaders. These were not empty boasts. Egypt truly did turn back the tide, but these victories, so proudly memorialized, were not clean or cheap. They were battles of sheer, exhausting defense. Egypt did not conquer new lands or gain new wealth. It spent its vast accumulated treasure, its military manpower, and its political capital simply to keep its own borders intact. The cost was catastrophic. The once boundless international influence of the pharaohs evaporated. The profitable trade routes to the Aegean and Anatolia were gone, cutting off the flow of luxury goods, timber, and metals like tin. The diplomatic club of great kings was now a ghost town with no equal peers left to address as brother. Internally, the strain was immense. Funding these constant defensive wars drained the royal treasury. The government's ability to reward officials and maintain the complex bureaucracy began to falter. Within a century of Ramesses III's reign, Egypt would slip into a long period of internal division, economic hardship, and loss of territory. It survived the collapse but emerged into a poorer, lonelier, and far weaker world. So why did Egypt endure when others did not? Two critical advantages likely made the difference. First, geography provided a unique buffer. While the eastern Mediterranean suffered a megadrought, Egypt's lifeline was the Nile, not the rain. Its annual flood, fed by distant monsoon rains in East Africa, remained largely reliable. This predictable agricultural cycle meant that even as others starved, Egypt could still feed its core population, maintaining a crucial baseline of social stability. Second, the pharaonic state was perhaps the most centralized and ideologically rigid of all the Bronze Age powers. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was a living god, the sole intermediary between the people and the divine. This absolute, theologically reinforced authority may have provided a stronger glue to hold society together in a prolonged crisis, preventing the kind of internal fragmentation that shattered the Hittite network of vassals. Egypt's story transforms our understanding of collapse. It shows that survival itself can be a kind of trauma. The kingdom avoided the utter oblivion that befell the Hittites, but it paid for that continuity with its golden age. It won every battle and lost the wider world. This Pyrrhic victory forces a difficult question in the face of a systemic unraveling: what is truly being saved? Is it the glory of the state or the well-being of its people? Egypt chose to preserve the state at all costs, and in doing so, set a course for its own long, slow decline. The ground remembers what people forget. To understand a collapse that left no written history of itself, we must learn to read the earth. Archaeologists approach sites like Ugarit or Hattusa not as tourists, but as detectives at a vast, ancient crime scene. Their primary clue is a universal signature of the era, a distinct band in the soil known simply as the destruction layer. Digging down through the centuries, you move through strata of quiet living, layers of pottery shards and foundation stones that tell of daily life. Then, abruptly, you hit a horizon of chaos. This layer is a dense, dark mixture of pulverized mudbrick, charcoal, ash, and shattered stone. It is a snapshot of catastrophe, a moment frozen in time that blankets city after city around the year 1200 before the Common Era. But a layer of ash alone does not tell the whole story. Was this fire set by an invader or sparked by an overturned lamp after an earthquake? Here, the science of archaeology becomes a forensic art. Specialists use tools like pottery typology, studying the evolution of jar shapes and decorative styles to create a relative timeline. A style common in one city's final days can be matched to fragments found in another, linking their fates. More precise still is radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of organic material like charred seeds or wooden beams from that destruction layer, giving scientists a probable date range for the calamity. These methods allow researchers to synchronize the collapses across hundreds of miles, revealing not a random scattering of disasters, but a terrifyingly concentrated event. The artifacts within the layer speak volumes. At Ugarit, it was the unsent letter in the kiln. At other sites, it is a hoard of precious jewelry or bronze tools hastily buried under a floor, a secret stash meant for retrieval that never happened. These are the belongings of people who believed they would return, but did not. Equally telling is what comes after, or rather, what does not. In most cases, the destruction layer is capped by a thick, sterile layer of wind-blown dirt or washed in silt. For centuries, no new foundations were laid, no new pottery was broken. The silence in the ground is profound. This forensic reading allows us to distinguish between types of violence. An earthquake leaves walls collapsed in a specific, outward pattern, with fires often starting later from broken hearths. Intentional destruction by human hands looks different, with evidence of systematic looting, the concentrated burning of key buildings, and sometimes the grim signs of conflict. Each layer tells its own story, and by comparing them, a pattern of systemic failure emerges across the entire region. Our understanding of this ancient unraveling is not handed down in a chronicle. It is assembled, fragment by fragment, from shattered pottery, scorched seeds, and fallen stones. It is an ongoing detective story where the ground itself is the primary witness, and every shovelful of earth holds a sentence in a lost world's final chapter. The words of the Bronze Age collapse were written not on paper but on clay and stone. While the archaeological layers show us what happened, the surviving texts tell us how it felt. These fragmentary records are the desperate voices of the age, etched into enduring materials by hands that could not know they were writing their own epitaphs. From the grandiose proclamations of pharaohs to the frantic notes of a dying city's last king, this written record transforms abstract collapse into intimate human drama. The most famous of these voices are the monumental inscriptions of the Egyptian pharaohs. On temple walls at Karnak and Medinet Habu, Ramesses III and his predecessor Merneptah carved their versions of events in towering hieroglyphs. These are texts of power and propaganda designed for eternity. They speak of crushing invaders like pottery and restoring order to a chaotic world. Yet, read between the lines of their boastful poetry, and you hear the strain of a civilization under siege. The very need to proclaim such total victory, repeatedly and with such theatrical force, hints at a reality far more precarious than the stone would have us believe. These are the shouts of a survivor trying to convince himself and his people that the danger has passed. A century earlier, a different kind of text reveals the world that was lost. The Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets found in Egypt, are the diplomatic backchannel of the late Bronze Age. Written in Akkadian, the international language of the time, they show the great kings of Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, and Assyria addressing each other as brothers. They negotiate marriages, exchange extravagant gifts of gold and lapis lazuli, and complain about the quality of the horses they've been sent. The tone is often one of strained politeness, a delicate dance of ego and obligation. One king writes, "Why have you sent me only 1 mina of gold? This is less than my ancestors sent, and it is an insult." This correspondence reveals the intricate web of mutual dependence and rivalry that held the system together. Its eventual cessation is as telling as its content. The silence of the diplomatic wire is a stark signal that the network has gone dead. But the most haunting texts come from the final days. They are not monuments but administrative documents that became final cries for help. In the ruins of Ugarit, we find that unsent letter pleading for aid as enemy ships burn the towns. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, tablets record a kingdom in its death throes. One poignant letter, sent from the Hittite queen Pujuhepa to the king of Egypt, strips away all royal pretense. In the midst of a devastating famine, she writes with raw desperation, "I have no grain in my lands." This simple, devastating sentence from one of the world's most powerful rulers lays bare the ultimate vulnerability. No amount of diplomacy or military might could command the rain to fall. Her plea is not for soldiers or alliances, but for basic sustenance, a testament to how completely the environmental crisis had undermined the foundations of imperial power. These clay tablets and stone carvings do more than list events, they archive emotion. They capture the fading hope of a scribe who still believes a letter might bring salvation, the cold fear of a ruler watching the horizon for ships, and the hollow despair of a queen with empty granaries. They remind us that this was not just a systemic failure of economics or logistics. It was a human catastrophe experienced by individuals who loved, feared, and hoped. Their words bridge the millennia, making the collapse feel not like a distant historical fact, but like a shared human experience of watching a world unravel. When the last scribe in Hattusa put down his stylus, he wasn't just ending a work shift, he was closing the book on an era. The silence that followed those final, desperate texts is perhaps the loudest statement of all. Their names are etched into the stone of Medinet Habu, a roster of mystery that has echoed for 3,000 years. The Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyon, the Jeka, the Weshesh. These are the sea peoples as named by the Egyptian scribes who fought them. For over a century, historians have tried to pin these names to the map to find the homelands from which these feared warriors supposedly sailed. The Peliset are often linked to the Philistines, who later settled on the coast of Canaan. The Shekelesh might connect to Sicily, the Denion to the Greek Danaioi, or perhaps to a people in Anatolia. It is a tantalizing puzzle, but one with pieces that refuse to fit neatly together. The fundamental problem is this: the Sea Peoples left no written records of their own. We hear about them only from the voices of their victims and adversaries. They are history's ghosts, defined entirely by the chaos they caused. This absence has allowed their legend to grow, transforming them into the ultimate scapegoat for the entire collapse, a convenient wave of barbarians washing civilization away. But modern scholarship urges us to listen more carefully to the silence. What if these names do not represent unified nations on the march, but something far more complex? The most compelling theory today suggests the Sea Peoples were not a single ethnic group or a coordinated alliance. Instead, they were likely a mixed multitude, a desperate collage of humanity set adrift by the very crises we have already explored. Picture not an organized armada, but a floating refugee crisis. Among them would have been displaced farmers from drought-stricken Anatolia, coastal fishermen whose ports had been shattered by earthquakes, skilled mercenaries whose royal employers could no longer pay them, and opportunistic pirates drawn to the spoils of a disintegrating world. They were a symptom, not the disease itself. Their movement was not a planned invasion from a specific point of origin, but a chaotic, circular migration. They moved along the coasts because that is where the remaining wealth and food were concentrated, attacking weakened cities not as a strategic campaign, but as a matter of survival. This reinterpretation is crucial because it changes how we assign blame. To label them as external destroyers is to miss the deeper, more unsettling truth. They were as much a product of the collapsing system as they were its accelerant. They were people who had been failed by the old order, now turning its remnants into the fuel for their own desperate journey. The enduring mystery of their identity teaches us a profound lesson about historical narrative. We are drawn to clear stories with defined villains, the barbarian at the gates. It is a simpler, more dramatic tale, but the reality of collapse is almost always messier, a web of pressures where the line between victim and aggressor, between cause and effect, becomes tragically blurred. The story of the Sea Peoples, in all its frustrating ambiguity, forces us to look beyond the easy label and into the complex human realities of a world coming undone. When a society fractures, where do its people go? The answer is rarely simple, and it is almost never kind. The old world's greatest strength became its fatal weakness. Bronze was not just a superior metal, it was a symbol of the entire palace-controlled system, a technology of exclusivity. Its production required a fragile, far-flung network that only a powerful central authority could maintain. But in the silent centuries after the collapse, a different, more democratic metal began its slow ascent from the ashes. Iron had been known for centuries, a rare and curious novelty, sometimes used for ceremonial daggers or ornaments. The Hittite texts even speak of it as a precious gift sent between kings. Yet its widespread practical use was hindered by a simple fact: the technology to smelt iron effectively, to heat it hot enough to become workable steel, was difficult and required immense skill. So why did iron rise just as bronze fell? The collapse itself provided the brutal incentive. With the international trade routes shattered, the steady flow of tin from distant mountains simply stopped. A local chieftain or a village could no longer send a merchant to a port and expect a shipment of bronze ingots, but iron ore was different. It was everywhere. You could find it in bogs, in surface deposits, in hillsides across the Mediterranean and Near East. The knowledge barrier was high, but the raw material was suddenly free and local. This shifted the entire equation of power. In the Bronze Age, control of metal meant control of society. The palace hoarded the bronze, allocated it to approved smiths, and equipped its loyal soldiers. This created a monopoly on both economic production and military force. Iron broke that monopoly. A skilled smith with a local bloomery furnace and a good source of charcoal could now produce tools and weapons without permission from any distant king. The technology was not owned by the palace, it was owned by the craftsmen. This had a profound, decentralizing effect on the political landscape that would emerge in the coming centuries. The grand, hierarchical states of the Bronze Age gave way to smaller, more fluid political units in the Iron Age, to hilltop chieftains, tribal confederations, and city-states whose power was based on local loyalty and local resources, not on controlling a brittle international web. The rise of iron was not the cause of the collapse, but it was one of its most significant and enduring consequences. The old system's failure created a vacuum, and into that vacuum flowed a technology that empowered the local over the global, the many over the few. It was a grim form of innovation forged in the fires of loss that would ultimately reshape the human story for 1,000 years to come. What other profound shifts begin not with a brilliant invention, but with the crumbling of the world that came before? The silence after the fall was not empty, it was filled with a different kind of life. For the vast majority of people, the end of the Bronze Age world did not mean the end of existence, but a dramatic change in its scale and rhythm. The towering palaces and their intricate bureaucracies vanished, and in their place a simpler, more localized pattern emerged. People left the vulnerable, starving cities and returned to the hills, to small villages and isolated farmsteads. The grand international network that demanded their grain and labor was gone, and with it went the need for the complex systems that had managed that extraction. This was not merely a decline, it was a profound societal simplification. The specialized roles of the palace scribe, the royal jeweler, and the international merchant ceased to exist because the society that required them had dissolved. People returned to a life of generalized subsistence where a family grew its own food, made its own simple tools, and provided for its own basic needs. Monumental architecture, that ultimate expression of centralized power and surplus, stopped completely. No one was building new cyclopean walls or vast treasuries. The energy of the community turned inward, toward survival and local cohesion rather than imperial glory. Trade did not disappear, but it shrank from a state-run enterprise spanning continents to a local exchange of necessities between neighboring villages. This shift asks us to reframe the very idea of collapse. From the perspective of a king or a high priest, it was an unmitigated catastrophe, the end of their world, their power, and their legacy. But from the viewpoint of a farmer who had spent a lifetime toiling to fill the palace granaries, the story might have felt different. The heavy burdens of taxation, the compulsory labor on royal projects, the constant demands of a distant elite, all of these pressures lifted. There was a liberation in this scaling down, a freedom from the weight of an unsustainable hierarchy. Life was undoubtedly harder in material terms, with less access to luxury goods and a narrower margin for error. Yet it may also have been more autonomous, more directly connected to the land and the immediate community. This dual legacy of loss and liberation reshaped the human landscape for centuries. The Dark Age that followed was not a period of ignorance but of reorganization. The old, brittle model of highly centralized, interdependent civilization had failed its stress test. What grew in its place was a more resilient, if less glittering, social fabric woven from countless local threads. The great lesson here is that collapse is not a single event but a transformation. It dismantles one structure so that another, perhaps humbler but more durable, can eventually emerge. When we look back at those silent centuries, we are not just seeing a void between empires, We are witnessing a society catching its breath, simplifying, and slowly gathering the strength for a new beginning on entirely different terms. The true measure of a civilization's end may not be found in fallen walls, but in silenced voices. Among the most profound casualties of the collapse was something invisible yet essential: the written word itself. Across the ruined landscape, entire systems of literacy simply vanished. The intricate cuneiform script used by the Hittites and the merchants of Ugarit, pressed into clay with a wedge-shaped stylus, stopped being taught. In the abandoned halls of Mycenaean and Pylos, the last scribe who understood the linear B syllabary put down his stylus for a final time. These were not mere alphabets, they were the living memory of their cultures. With their disappearance, vast libraries of knowledge were rendered mute. Legal codes that had governed trade and conflict for generations became indecipherable lines on a broken tablet. Poetic hymns, administrative records detailing the distribution of olive oil and wool, diplomatic treaties, all of it slipped into an impenetrable silence. This was more than a loss of data, it was a severing of cultural continuity, a reset button pressed on collective memory. For the people who came after, the world of their ancestors was not a history to learn from, but a mystery buried in the ground, a realm of giants and heroes spoken of only in faint, distorted legend. The darkness that followed was not merely political or economic, it was cognitive. The very tools for organizing complex thought and transmitting it across generations had been forgotten. It would take nearly 4 centuries for a new, revolutionary system of writing to emerge and spread, the simple and adaptable Phoenician alphabet, which would eventually give rise to the Greek and Latin scripts we know today. This staggering loss forces a humbling realization. Civilization is not just about monuments and armies, it is fundamentally about information, the shared story a society tells itself about who it is and how it functions. That story is written in laws, in literature, in ledgers. When the institutions that curate, teach, and protect that story dissolve, the narrative can break. The clay tablets left behind in Hattusa were not just artifacts, they were a stranded language waiting centuries for a new mind to learn how to listen. It makes you wonder, in our own digital age where so much of our collective knowledge exists as fragile patterns of light on a server, what would remain of our story if the power to read it ever went out? The story of the Bronze Age is not locked in the distant past. It is a mirror reflecting our own interconnected world with startling clarity. We too live within a delicate global network, a system of profound interdependence where a delay at a single port or a shortage of a single component can ripple across continents, disrupting everything from medicine to microchips. Our just-in-time supply chains are marvels of efficiency, but like the bronze trade routes of old, they have little redundancy, operating on a faith in perpetual stability. Climate stress, once a prolonged drought across Anatolia, now manifests as intensifying weather patterns affecting global food production. The potential for a cascading failure, where economic, environmental, and social pressures amplify one another, is a lesson written in 3,000-year-old dust. So we must ask ourselves, are the vulnerabilities of our brilliant system different in kind, or merely in scale? The ancient world's collapse whispers that efficiency without resilience is a dangerous bargain. This history urges us to think in terms of antifragility, the idea that systems can be designed to gain from disorder rather than simply withstand it. The scattered, localized communities that emerged after the Bronze Age collapse, while poorer in material wealth, demonstrated a rugged resilience. They survived not through complex international treaties, but through deep knowledge of their immediate environment and social bonds built at a human scale. Their example is not a call to abandon globalization, but a prompt to weave stronger local threads into our global tapestry. What would it look like to design critical systems, from energy to food production, so that they can adapt, flex, and even improve when part of the network is stressed or fails. It is about building in buffers and backups, fostering diverse solutions, and remembering that the ultimate foundation of any civilization is not its stock markets or data centers, but the health of its communities and the ecosystems they depend upon. The past does not offer a blueprint, but it provides a vital stress test for our assumptions. By studying how a networked world once came apart, we gain the perspective to ask the most important question of all: how do we build one that can endure? One persistent image of the end is a single, fiery day of doom. The reality is far more complex and in many ways more unsettling. The idea of a civilization vanishing overnight is a powerful metaphor, but it fails the test of historical and archaeological evidence. For the people living through it, the unraveling was not a sudden explosion, but a creeping shadow. The timescale we are dealing with spans perhaps 50 to 100 years, roughly 2 or 3 human generations. In the grand sweep of history, that is indeed a blink of an eye, a rapid unmaking. But for a society, it was a prolonged crisis, a slow-motion fracture where each year brought a new strain, a fresh defeat, another reason to lose hope. This time frame is crucial for understanding the nature of the collapse. It was not an asteroid strike or a volcanic winter that ended everything in a season. It was a cascade where the failure of one system placed unbearable stress on the next, creating a domino effect of destabilization that ultimately became irreversible. Contrast this with another famous collapse, that of the Western Roman Empire. That process was a slow bleed over centuries, a gradual transformation where Roman institutions, culture, and identity faded and blended with new influences. The Bronze Age collapse was different. It was a system's failure of shocking speed and completeness within its core region. The palaces, the writing, the specialized crafts, and the international trade networks did not fade, they snapped. This distinction helps us categorize types of historical change. Some are transformations, slow evolutions from one state to another. Others are genuine collapses, where the foundational structures of a complex society cease to function in a relatively short period, leaving a landscape of radical simplification in their wake. Furthermore, the collapse was not a uniform blanket of darkness across the entire map. While the Hittite Empire vanished and Mycenaean Greece fell silent, other powers demonstrated remarkable resilience. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrian kingdom, though shaken, managed to hold its core territories together. It retrenched, fortified, and endured, eventually emerging from the chaos as a dominant power in the subsequent Iron Age. Similarly, Egypt, as we have seen, survived though profoundly weakened. This patchwork outcome is another vital correction to the myth of a total, apocalyptic event. It shows that the perfect storm of crises, drought, earthquakes, migration, and internal revolt hit with varying intensity in different places. Some societies possessed deeper reservoirs of grain, more defensible geography, or more cohesive internal structures that allowed them to weather the storm. Embracing this nuanced view is not just about academic accuracy. It is about gaining a more sophisticated and applicable understanding of how complex systems fail. The lesson is not in a mythical single point of failure, but in the concept of compounding crises. A drought alone might cause hardship. An earthquake alone would require rebuilding. A trade disruption alone would force adaptation. But when all these stresses converge within a narrow window of time, they cease to be separate problems. They become interconnected shocks that overload a society's capacity to respond. The system's resilience is exhausted. This model moves us away from sensational tales of invaders and cataclysms and toward a sobering study in vulnerability. It asks us to look at our own world not for a single looming disaster, but for the potential convergence of multiple, simultaneous stresses. How many shocks can a system absorb before its ability to adapt is simply overwhelmed? The answer, written in the silent layers of ash and the abandoned clay tablets, suggests the margin for error is often thinner than we dare believe. Decades of meticulous archaeology have not resolved every puzzle. In fact, some of the most fundamental questions about the collapse have only deepened with time. Why, for instance, did the great Hittite capital of Hattusa show signs of a planned, orderly evacuation, while Ugarit was consumed in a single, fiery assault? The evidence suggests a spectrum of endings, from violent conquest to quiet dissolution, and this variation itself is a clue. It tells us that the perfect storm did not strike every shore with equal force. Local conditions, leadership decisions, and sheer chance shaped each city's final chapter, making a single, unified narrative impossible. The precise sequence of events also remains frustratingly out of focus. Did the drought begin before the earthquakes, pushing societies to a breaking point just as the ground shook? Or did the seismic disasters come first, crippling infrastructure and making populations uniquely vulnerable to the climate shift that followed? In each region, the dominoes likely fell in a different order. Untangling this chronology is like trying to reconstruct the exact path of a hurricane from the wreckage it left behind. We see the devastation clearly, but the minute-by-minute timeline is lost to the wind. Then there is the haunting question of the displaced. When the cities emptied, where did all the people go? The archaeological record goes quiet, but human lives continued. Emerging scientific techniques are beginning to offer whispers of an answer. Ancient DNA analysis, for example, can trace population movements by comparing genetic material from before and after the collapse. Early studies suggest significant migrations, with new genetic signatures appearing in places like the Levant, potentially aligning with the arrival of groups like the Philistines. Similarly, improved climate proxies, from deeper sediment cores to more precise analysis of ancient plant remains, are refining our picture of the drought's severity and geographic footprint. These tools allow us to move from broad theories to specific, testable data about human and environmental dynamics. This embrace of uncertainty is not a failure of history, but its very essence. The Bronze Age collapse sits at the edge of our vision, a period where written records cease and the story must be pieced together from fragments. It reminds us that the past is not a solved puzzle, but a living field of inquiry. Some of these mysteries may never be fully answered, and that is part of what makes this era so compelling. It invites us to sit with the gaps, to appreciate the limits of our knowledge, and to wonder about the countless untold stories buried in the silent earth. In the end, the collapse endures not just as a cautionary tale about systemic fragility, but as a timeless reminder that history is always a conversation between what we can know and what we must imagine. A king's final plea for help, left unsent in a kiln, speaks to a deeper failure of leadership. While we have traced the impersonal forces of drought and earthquake, the collapse also exposes the limits of human command. In the final decades, the rulers of these great kingdoms were not passive victims. They were active participants in their own unraveling, making decisions within a crumbling framework that often accelerated the disaster. Their responses, preserved in those fragmentary letters and monuments, reveal a spectrum of crisis management, from desperate mobilization to tragic paralysis. The pharaohs of Egypt chose the path of monumental defense, marshalling their remaining wealth and manpower into a fortified, inward-looking stance. It was a strategy of survival at any cost, one that preserved the state but sacrificed its soul and its future prosperity. In stark contrast, the last king of Ugarit appears trapped by the very system he served. His troops were deployed according to treaty obligations, leaving his own city defenseless when the crisis arrived at his doorstep. He followed the old rules of international loyalty, but those rules no longer functioned in a world where every ally was fighting for its own life. This stark difference forces a difficult question. Could more agile leadership or deeper cooperation have changed the outcome? Was this collapse truly inevitable, or did a failure of collective imagination seal their fate? The evidence suggests these hierarchical systems, so brilliant at managing stability, were inherently brittle in the face of unpredictable multi-front crises. Power was concentrated at the top, in figures whose authority was often divinely ordained and unchallengeable. This created a fatal rigidity. When unprecedented droughts parched the land, the response from a palace might have been to demand more grain from failing provinces, to double down on control rather than innovate. When mysterious raiders appeared, the instinct was to meet them with the traditional bronze-clad army, even as the supply lines for that bronze were disintegrating. There was little room for local adaptation or decentralized decision-making, the very tools that foster resilience. A village that saw the rains fail might know to switch crops or dig new wells, but it likely lacked the autonomy or resources to act without royal decree. And the king, isolated in his palace, receiving reports filtered through layers of anxious bureaucracy, could not possibly perceive the full, interconnected scale of the disaster in time. The lesson here is not about blaming individual leaders, but about understanding the architecture of power they inhabited. Their systems were optimized for extracting surplus and maintaining order, not for learning, adapting, or building trust-based networks that could hold under extreme stress. When the pharaohs appealed for unity, it was a command from a god-king. When the king of Ugarit appealed for help, it was a transaction between royal peers. What seems missing is a deeper foundation of mutual interest and shared vulnerability, a cooperative spirit that could transcend collapsing institutions. This shifts our view from the spectacle of falling walls to the quiet drama of the council chamber and the throne room. It asks us to consider what true crisis leadership requires, not just the strength to command, but the wisdom to listen, the flexibility to abandon failing plans, and the humility to build coalitions on trust rather than mere obligation. In the silent aftermath, the scattered villages that endured did so precisely because they operated on that smaller, more trusting, more adaptive scale. They had no grand strategy, but they possessed the local knowledge and social bonds to navigate a broken world. The collapse of the Bronze Age kingdoms, therefore, stands as a profound case study in the limits of top-down control when the world itself becomes unpredictable. It suggests that the ultimate test of any leadership structure is not how it manages prosperity, but how it navigates the uncharted and the unforeseen. The story of the collapse is not just a human one, it is a story of the land and the sky. A growing field of study called environmental history asks us to see societies not as separate from their surroundings, but as deeply woven into them, partners in a continuous dialogue with soil, water, and climate. From this vantage point, the Bronze Age collapse transforms from a political or military event into a profound biocultural rupture, a moment when the ecological foundation of a civilization simply gave way. These societies were not passive victims of a changing climate, they were exquisitely and dangerously optimized for a world that no longer existed. Their agricultural practices, their settlement patterns, their very conception of wealth were all calibrated to a specific, reliable pattern of rainfall and seasonal flood. The 300-year megadrought was a shift so severe and prolonged that it exceeded every adaptation they had ever developed. Their irrigation canals ran dry, their plows turned dust, and the palace granaries, those symbols of centralized power, held nothing but echoes. This framing removes the idea of human mastery from the equation. It argues that these kingdoms, for all their grandeur, were always participants in a natural system far greater than themselves. Their collapse becomes a lesson in maladaptation, showing how a society's greatest strengths during times of stability can become its fatal vulnerabilities when the environment changes. The intricate palace bureaucracy could redistribute grain, but it could not command the clouds. The mighty bronze army could defend borders, but it could not hold back desertification. This perspective is not merely academic, it is urgently relevant. We now live in an age defined by human impact on the planet, an era some scientists call the Anthropocene. Like the Bronze Age elites, our modern global system is built on assumptions of climatic stability. Our agriculture, our coastal cities, our supply chains, all are designed for a planetary regime that is demonstrably shifting. The silent ruins of Hattusa and Ugarit whisper a caution that echoes across the millennia. They remind us that environmental history is not a sidebar to the human story. It is the very stage upon which that story unfolds. To ignore the deep, inseparable link between culture and climate is to risk repeating a pattern of fragility on a planetary scale. The collapse challenges us to replace a narrative of conquest with one of integration, to see ourselves not as rulers of nature, but as one thread within a vast and interdependent web. What would it mean to build a civilization that learns from their silence, one designed not for dominance, but for resilience within the rhythms of an ever-changing Earth? The ruins left behind a silence, but the stories never truly died. Instead, the immense trauma of the collapse seeped into the bedrock of cultural memory, resurfacing centuries later in the foundational myths and epic poems of new civilizations. These were not history books, but imaginative landscapes where raw historical experience was processed, transformed, and given meaning. The most famous of these echoes is the epic cycle of the Trojan War. While the war described by Homer is a tapestry of gods and heroes, its historical core may lie in the chaotic final century of the Bronze Age. Archaeologists have found evidence that the city of Troy, a vital hub controlling trade into the Black Sea, was indeed destroyed by fire and conflict around the right time frame. The Homeric tale of a grand coalition of Greek kings sailing across the sea to besiege a wealthy Anatolian city could be a poetic, garbled memory of the kind of large-scale, destabilizing raids and counter-raids that characterized the era's end. The epic preserves the feel of that lost world, its warrior ethos, its gleaming palaces, its interconnected rivalries before framing its catastrophic fall as a singular, legendary event. A similar process of mythic transformation may be at work in the biblical narratives of the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan. Some scholars place these foundational stories within the turbulent context of the late Bronze Age collapse. The image of a people escaping a crumbling empire, wandering in a wilderness, and then encountering fortified cities in Canaan could reflect the experiences of the many displaced groups moving through the fractured landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. The biblical description of the walls of Jericho falling down might symbolically encapsulate the widespread collapse of urban fortifications, whether from seismic activity, siege, or abandonment. These stories provided a powerful narrative of identity and divine purpose for the emerging communities of the Iron Age, rooting their presence in the land within a framework of epic struggle and renewal that made sense of a deeply confusing past. Perhaps the most poignant echo is the Greek concept of a lost golden age, a time of peace, abundance, and effortless prosperity that existed long before the present era of toil and strife. This pervasive myth, found in the works of Hesiod and later poets, feels like a cultural haunting. It mirrors with uncanny resonance the archaeological reality of the prosperous, interconnected late Bronze Age world that preceded the collapse. The subsequent centuries of poverty, isolation, and cultural simplification, the Greek Dark Age, would have stood in stark contrast to the material evidence of that earlier grandeur. The massive cyclopean walls of Mycenaean citadels, which later Greeks believed were built by giants, were literal monuments to a forgotten scale of achievement. The myth of a golden age may have been the only way a society without written history could explain the majestic ruins in its midst and the palpable sense that the world had once been richer, more ordered, and more magnificent. This connection between hard archaeology and soft story is profoundly revealing. It shows that when a civilization experiences a shock as profound as systemic collapse, the event does not simply vanish. When factual records are lost, the human need to explain and give shape to catastrophe channels the experience into the realm of legend. Historical truth becomes archetypal narrative, wars become epic clashes of heroes, mass migrations become guided journeys to a promised land, and a lost era of prosperity becomes a paradisiacal age. These stories then perform a crucial cultural function. They provide a shared past, a sense of origin, and lessons about hubris, resilience, and divine will. They are the means by which a society, born from the ashes of a forgotten world, stitches together a new identity, using the frayed and magnificent threads of what came before. The ghosts of the Bronze Age did not haunt empty palaces. They found a home in the stories we never stopped telling. From the silence of abandoned palaces, new voices began to speak. The Iron Age did not arrive with a fanfare, but with the quiet, persistent work of communities who had learned a hard lesson about putting all their faith in a single, fragile system. What emerged from the long twilight was not a restoration of the old order, but a series of bold, decentralized experiments in how to build a society. The phoenix that rose from these ashes wore many different faces, each shaped by the trauma of what had been lost. Along the narrow coast of the Levant, a people known as the Phoenicians looked not to vast inland empires but to the open sea. With the old Bronze Age trade monopolies broken, they became the new masters of commerce, not as palace-directed bureaucrats, but as independent merchant princes operating from powerful city-states like Tyre and Sidon. Their greatest innovation was not a product but a tool for thought. They perfected a simple, accessible alphabet of just 22 characters, a system so efficient it could be learned by merchants and artisans, not just a priestly class. This script would travel across the Mediterranean, becoming the ancestor of Greek, Latin, and ultimately our own writing systems. They rebuilt the trade network, but on a more agile, entrepreneurial model, connecting the entire basin and even venturing beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Their story was one of adaptation, turning the collapse of land-based empires into an opportunity for maritime enterprise. Meanwhile, in the rocky hills of Greece, a different kind of rebirth was taking shape. The scattered, impoverished villages of the Dark Age slowly coalesced into a revolutionary political unit, the polis or city-state. Places like Athens and Sparta rejected the model of the all-powerful Bronze Age king. Instead, they experimented with concepts of citizenship, shared governance, and civic identity. The simplicity forced upon them by the collapse became a virtue, clearing the ideological ground for philosophy, drama, and new forms of political debate. Their foundational epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were in many ways haunting echoes of the lost Mycenaean world, but they served a new purpose, providing a common cultural heritage for people building a society from scratch. In the highlands of Canaan, another community was forging an identity in the crucible of displacement and conflict. The Israelites, a confederation of tribes, defined themselves not through a mighty king or a palace archive, but through a radical and enduring idea, a covenant with a single, universal God. This monotheistic faith, crystallized during this formative period, offered a powerful source of resilience and unity for a people without a traditional empire. Their sacred texts, compiled later, grappled profoundly with themes of exile, survival, and moral law, reflecting the turbulent journey from a collapsed world into a new one. Each of these Iron Age societies represents a distinct answer to the same existential question. After everything falls apart, what do you build in its place? The Phoenicians built a commercial network, the Greeks built a civic ideal, the Israelites built a spiritual covenant. None sought to recreate the top-down, palace-centric globality of the Bronze Age. Their solutions were leaner, more flexible, and often fiercely local, yet their influence would eventually span the globe. This is the Phoenix effect in its fullest sense. Collapse is not an end, but a brutal, transformative reset. It does not merely destroy, it selectively clears the ground, removing entrenched structures and creating space for radical innovation. The old ideas of power, written in clay and enforced by bronze, were washed away. What grew in their place were the seeds of the classical world, ideas about democracy, alphabetic literacy, and monotheistic faith that would fundamentally shape human history for millennia to come. It offers a note of cautious, long-term hope. Human civilization is not a single, linear story of progress toward a peak, nor is it a simple cycle of inevitable rise and fall. It is a story of successive transformations, of systems that grow complex, face their limits, and then reorganize into new, often unrecognizable forms. The silence after the fall was not an empty void, but a field of possibility waiting for the next chapter to be written. The halls are silent now, the clay tablets cold. We have walked through the bustling ports and towering palaces of a lost world, witnessing how drought, quake, invasion, and revolt converged into a perfect storm. There is no single villain in this story, no lone catastrophe to blame. The collapse of the late Bronze Age stands as history's great lesson in systemic fragility, a demonstration of how deeply our political, economic, and environmental fates are intertwined. When multiple threads of a civilization's web are pulled at once, the entire tapestry can unravel with breathtaking speed. This is not merely an ancient curiosity, it is a mirror held up to our own glittering, globalized age. We too live in a world of profound interdependence, where a disruption on one continent echoes instantly on another. Our systems are engineered for remarkable efficiency, but often at the cost of resilience. The past whispers an urgent question: how do we build networks that are not only brilliant but also durable? How do we honor the delicate balance between human ambition and the planetary systems that sustain it? Historian J.G. Manning reminds us that things that seem permanent can disappear. That observation is not a prophecy of doom, but a call to mindful stewardship. The ghosts of Hattusa and Ugarit do not ask us to live in fear of collapse, but to build with wisdom, to weave stronger local threads into our global fabric, and to remember that the ultimate foundation of any society is the well-being of its people and the health of the land they call home. If this journey into one of history's greatest mysteries has captivated you, consider subscribing for more explorations into the enigmas of our shared past. Let us know in the comments which facet of this ancient story, the climate shift, the seismic unrest, or the social unraveling, resonates most deeply with you as you look at our world today.